In October 1347, 12 ships anchored at ports in Sicily. Those who rushed over were horrified by what they saw. Almost everyone on board was dead or barely alive. Their skin broke out in black boils that oozed pus and blood. It was horrifying. The authorities in Sicily told the ship to leave, but by the time it did, the damage was already done. The Black Death had reached Europe, and millions of people would die in what is known as one of the worst disasters in history. Let's look at how the bubonic plague killed at least a third, if not more, of Europe's people. In this episode, we talk about what made the Black Death so deadly. The plague hit Europe hard, but it wasn't the first place it happened. It also knew about the disease that was already killing and destroying a lot of people in other places. Before the infected ships arrived in Sicily, rumors spread far and wide about a terrible disease that was killing people in China, India, Egypt, Persia, and Syria. No one knew what caused the disease or why it seemed to follow trade routes from the near to the far east. Also, when it came out, it seemed like nothing could stop it. When someone got the Black Death, their lymph nodes in their groin or under their arms would start to swell. Soon, the growths would turn into large, blackish-blue lumps about the size of eggs or, in the worst cases, grow to the size of apples. The wounds would then get worse and use different body fluids. People who have the disease could develop any of a number of other symptoms. Some of these were a high temperature, pain, chills, sweating, an upset stomach, and diarrhea. Those who saw the effects firsthand said that this was almost always followed by death. All it seemed to take to catch the disease was a brief touch with the clothes of someone who was sick, though some doctors said that it was the spirit leaving the body of the dead person that infected others as it passed by. At this time in history, it was clear that people didn't know much about how diseases really spread. Most people couldn't do anything to stop it. Only a few islands that were cut off from the rest of Europe by water were free of the pandemic plague. The rest of the people did not have it so good. The bacteria got through the defenses of almost every city in Europe, and people who looked fine one day could be dead a few days later. Even though it was rare, it was possible for someone to live for a week or two before they died. To make matters worse, most people with the disease had no symptoms for the first few days, so no one knew they had it. This meant that it was almost impossible to keep them away from the rest of the world at this point. People who tried to protect themselves by leaving the country did the next best thing. Even there, we're not safe. The plague also killed a lot of animals, including pigs, cows, chickens, goats, and sheep. This was such a big problem that there was a shortage of wool all over the continent. While about 30% of people died in many places in Europe, 90% of the people in the city of Florence, Italy, died. When there weren't enough people left to bury the dead, sometimes their bodies stayed where they died. There are many villages in France. Not only did the Black Death leave some areas and other places without a single person left, but it also turned them into ghost towns. Some places where people used to live were eventually taken back by the forest that grew around them. After World War I was over, it took aerial photography to find out that these places were once homes for men, women, and children. Most estimates put the number of people who died in Europe between 50 and 70 million, or around 30%. But the CDC says it killed up to 60% of the population, which is a lot more. Estimates from around the world range from 155 million to 200 million. At the time, there were only 500 million people on Earth. So, no, almost half of its people were killed, and some sources say even more than that. So how did the Black Death spread so quickly and kill so many people and animals so quickly? Well, as was already said, the 1300s didn't have much in the way of scientific knowledge. Not only did people not know what caused the plague or how it spread, but there were also many failed attempts to treat it. You are, in fact, seeing a pestis. The Black Death or bubonic plague was caused by a bacterium that spread quickly. It can also be spread in many ways, but obviously not by drinking contaminated spirits. Many people think that in its later stages, it could have changed into an airborne strain that could be spread to a new host with a simple cough or sneeze. But all strains that are airborne or in the early stages of those that aren't are thought to have been spread by a flea or like spite and many animals. In addition to farm animals, animals like squirrels, rabbits, chipmunks, and mice can be hosts for the bacteria and blood-sucking bugs. But many scientists say that the urban rat was by far the most important factor in the spread of the Black Death. One reason for this is that rats have been seen to get sick with symptoms that are very similar to those people get when they get sick with a modern plague. Flea bites were common among people who had the illness. Recent outbreaks also tend to happen after what are called rat falls, or times when a lot of rodents die all at once. For what reason, I don't know. So, the most popular theory is that the Black Death started when plague-infected rats died and their fleas looked for more blood in an easy-to-find source, which was sometimes a person who had been bitten by a rat with the disease. This person would then be in contact with the bacteria that kills. In the mid-1300s, ships were often infested with furry rodents that thrived in the dark, damp environment. This seems to support this theory. And after the death ship got to Sicily, the plague kept spreading along trade routes, just like it had in Asia, to other ports, cities all over Europe, and even as far south as North Africa. But recently, some changes have been suggested to this theory based on rats. As we just talked about, the Black Death isn't the only time the plague has happened in the world's history. There have been outbreaks before and after, and the most recent ones happened in a completely different way. Europe's Black Death spread much faster, and as far as history goes, there is no record of a large number of rats dying in the days or months before it. Now, some scientists think that fleas and lice on humans were really to blame for the disease in Europe. Infected people would get bit by fleas, which would then move on to other people. One by one, people who were nearby joined them. They talked about how the math behind how a rat flea spreads is very different from how a human flea or lice spreads. And when data from 7 out of 9 European cities were put into simulations, the human flea model fit the data more closely. Those who have this new evidence admit that there is still a lot of disagreement about what caused the plague. But whether the fleas were from humans or rats, it was likely a blood-sucking pest of one kind or another that spread it. This means that the Black Death may not have been the only thing that killed a lot of people. When the bodies of people who had died were taken out of mass graves in England, anthrax spores were also found with them. If there had been anthrax at the same time as the plague, things would have been a lot worse. Anthrax can be spread not only through sweat, saliva, or tears, but also through skin-to-skin contact. In other words, people could have gotten one of several diseases that could have killed them during the Black Death pandemic. People whose immune systems were already weak were more likely to get sick from the plague because of anthrax and other diseases. Also, it's possible that some of the people who died from the Black Death actually died from anthrax or other diseases. The way the Black Death was treated didn't help, and it may have even killed people or spread it further by accident. For example, at least in the beginning, doctors would do things like draw blood from people who had the plague. Here is where the sick people's veins or arteries in their necks or arms were cut so that their blood could flow. People in ancient Egypt and Greece believed that the body needed the right balance of blood, phlegm, and bile to be healthy. Bloodletting was thought to fix an imbalance of too much blood, which was thought to make a person sick. Unfortunately, The method didn't seem to help the plague victims any more than it helped Charles II, or George Washington's, happened a few hundred years later. When Washington woke up with a sore throat and King Charles had a seizure after bloodletting, they both died soon after. Boil lancing was another way to treat boils, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Someone would basically lance or stick a sharp object into the boils to get the gooey insides out. If this wasn't done, they would keep getting bigger and their dead blood and pus would eventually poison their host. On the other hand, popping them could also cause toxic shock, which would likely kill the person. The boils may spread the disease even more because they contain things that are very contagious. Other methods, like burning different herbs or putting the sick person in vinegar or rose water, didn't work either, which wasn't a big surprise. After failing over and over again, and in an effort to protect themselves, many doctors just stopped taking new patients. Even priests stopped giving last rites because they were afraid for their own safety. Where people failed, nature didn't do much to help. People didn't know how to deal with the plague, and their genes made them more likely to die from it. Researchers looked at the remains of the people who lived in Europe at the time and found that only 0.2% of them had a gene that gave them some kind of immunity. Since so many people who could get sick from the plague died from it, the other 99.8% didn't have any. They did not pass on their genes to the generations that came after them. A lot of the people who did have the gene went on to have children. Because of this, there is now a 15% chance that a Caucasian American will have some resistance to the disease. This is pretty good news, especially since the modern plague is still around. One meeting between the so-called death ships and people would kill so many men, women, and children that it would change the course of history. How do you feel? Was it spread by fleas on people or on rats? Tell us in the comments below. Also, don't forget to watch our other video, Could the Black Death or the Plague Happen Again? Thanks for coming to watch. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.